My millionaire son gave his mother-in-law a ranch with a ribbon on the gate. He gave me a blender, now I'm still taped shut from the store. Didn't know what else you'd need, Mom. He forgot I was the reason he could afford silverware in college, so I filed a lawsuit for every cent, every slight, and every year he forgot me. By the time it hits court, he'll wish he'd just said thank you. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Clara Whitman tugged her cardigan tighter around her frame as she stepped onto the stone pathway leading to Blake and Sherry's oversized log mansion, a showpiece of rustic pretension in the snowy outskirts of Bozeman. The driveway lights gleamed against the fresh powder like a stage set, and Clara already knew the part she was expected to play. Inside, the holiday gathering buzzed with curated warmth. Scented pine candles flickered from every surface, and the scent of cinnamon-glazed ham floated in a perfect balance with something designer. Blake stood near the fireplace in a charcoal cashmere sweater, holding a rocks glass like it was part of his brand. "There she is," he said as she entered, voice smooth, camera ready. "Glad you could make it, Mom." Clara gave a small nod, brushing snow from her coat. "Wouldn't miss it." Sherry swept in, heels clicking on the polished wood. "You look adorable in that little scarf. So cozy." Clara smiled politely. Her scarf was hand-woven, something Blake's father had bought her in Jackson years ago. Sherry wouldn't know that, wouldn't care. Trish Langford was already holding court on the leather sectional, cheeks rosy with wine and self-congratulation. "I told them," she said to no one in particular, "if you're going to do a ranch, do a ranch. Guest wing, stable access, wraparound deck, and that view, oh, the view." Clara sat on the edge of a velvet dining chair, straight-backed and quiet. Blake made a dramatic show of clearing his throat. "Okay," he said, "let's open gifts." Everyone applauded like it was a charity auction. Trish's gift came first, by design, Clara suspected. Sherry handed her mother a glossy envelope tied with gold ribbon. Trish squealed before she even opened it. Inside was a deed, lettered and notarized. "To Mom," Blake said, raising his glass. "Welcome to your dream ranch." Trish gasped, clutching her chest like she was on a soap opera. "Oh, Blakey, it's perfect. I can see myself there already. Horses, brunches, book clubs on the terrace." Sherry dabbed her mother's eyes with a cocktail napkin and beamed. "You deserve it, Mom." Clara watched the scene unfold, her expression still. Then Sherry turned to her with manic enthusiasm, reaching under the tree. "And now, something special for our Clara." Clara unfolded the wrapping carefully. A plain white appliance box peeked out, Blender brand logo front and center. Inside, nestled in styrofoam, a generic high-speed blender. Still tagged, still boxed. Sherry leaned in, smiling too hard. "You love smoothies, right? That one has 3 settings, and a to-go lid." Blake laughed softly. "Healthy habits, just looking out for you, Mom." Clara looked at the box, then at her son. "Well," she said, voice smooth as a frostbitten pond. Thoughtful. No one heard the blade behind her words. Trish hooted, oblivious. "You'll love the stable suite, Clara. It's like staying at a 5-star resort, heated floors." Clara placed the blender box carefully by her feet and folded her hands in her lap. Across the room, Trish popped open another bottle of wine and toasted herself. "Here's to family and fresh starts." Clara's gaze settled on the fireplace mantel, lined with framed photos, Blake and Trish on horses, Sherry in designer boots, holding a pitchfork like a Halloween prop. Her own face was nowhere in sight. The room burst into laughter at something Trish said about ranch people not needing diplomas. Clara's eyes didn't flicker, but her knuckles went white against her lap. "I'll be heading out soon," she said softly, to no one in particular. "Oh, stay for pie," Sherry chirped. "Another time," Clara replied, standing slowly. She picked up the blender box with both hands, its weight oddly symbolic. As she walked out, Blake called after her, tone cheerful, rehearsed. "Glad you liked the gift, Mom." She turned her head just slightly, not enough to meet his eyes. "I always knew you were good at wrapping things," she said, "even empty ones." Then she stepped into the Montana cold, the door closing behind her with a final padded click. The cold followed Clara home like a silent accusation. She set the blender box down on her kitchen counter, still unopened, still pristine. For a long moment she simply stared at it. Then she opened the drawer beneath her sink, pulled out a black Sharpie, and scrawled one word across the cardboard: returned. She pushed the box aside and moved to the hallway closet, the one no one ever looked in but her. Past the raincoats, the dusty snowshoes, and the moth-proof garment bags was a fireproof lockbox with a handle rubbed dull from years of use. She took it out, slow and sure. The key was still taped behind a ceramic angel on the top shelf, exactly where she'd left it since Blake's father passed. She clicked it open. Inside, nestled in decades of careful filing, were rows of labeled folders. One by one, she flipped through: Whitman Holdings, Deed 1983, Land Notes, 2004, Joint Tax Filings, Easement Agreements, Fencing Contracts. Her fingers stilled on a yellowed envelope marked Original Parcel Survey, Elk Creek Ranch. She opened it. 200 acres, split right down the middle in legal print. 70 acres were hers alone, where her modest ranch house still stood, where she still fed the chickens, still patched her own fences. The other 120? Shared title. She and Blake. Joint tenancy with survivorship rights. A fact Blake had chosen to forget the moment his bank account started outpacing his memory. Clara folded the deed with reverence and slipped it into her handbag. By the time she arrived at Eli Torres's cabin office just outside Gallatin Gateway, the sky was a bruised lavender. Snow hung in the air like breath waiting to land. Eli opened the door wearing wool socks and holding a mug of oolong tea. He hadn't aged gracefully, but he had aged with clarity. His silver beard looked like it could write its own memoir. "Clara," he said, stepping aside. "I was wondering when you'd show up." She sat down across from him at the old pine desk that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke. She handed him the deed. 1983, she said. "We filed it the spring Robbie finished rebuilding the west fence line." Eli adjusted his glasses. "This is clean. Original ink, notarized. No liens, no gaps in chain of title." He flipped a few pages. "And this?" He tapped a signed agreement from 2009, scribbled on Whitman Devco letterhead, "is where he promised to handle the logistics and take over maintenance costs." Clara nodded. "He never filed a buyout. Just started acting like it was his. Said we'd work out the details later." Eli leaned back in his creaky swivel chair. "He assumed you'd forget." "I don't forget." "No, you don't." Clara's voice lowered. "How enforceable is a handshake agreement from 16 years ago?" Eli lifted the deed. "If you've got this," he flipped it up, "it's a hell of a lot stronger than a ribbon tied around a deed folder on Christmas Eve." Clara let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for over a decade. Eli leaned forward. "What do you want to do?" "I want him to stop pretending I don't exist on land I helped map, fence, and pay taxes on." Eli smirked. "You're talking about reminding Blake Whitman who signed the first surveyor's check." Clara stood. "I'm talking about reminding him who laid the first goddamn fence post with her own hands while he was still learning to spell acreage." Eli whistled low. "Hell of a way to spend retirement, Clara." She looked out his frosted window, at the wide white sprawl of Montana, silent and waiting. "I never planned on war," she said. "But if he wants to draw battle lines, I'll bring the blueprint." Eli slid the deed back into its folder and closed it with deliberate care. "Then let's begin with what's legally yours." Clara gave a nod, crisp and certain. "And after that, what's morally mine?" The attic hadn't changed much since Robbie died. Its wooden beams still groaned in winter like tired bones, and the smell of cedar and insulation wrapped around Clara like memory itself. She climbed the creaking steps one at a time, flashlight tucked under her arm, the bitter wind from the cracked window brushing her neck like a warning. She hadn't been up here in years, not since Blake stopped pretending to ask her opinion and started making decisions with his bank account. But tonight, she wasn't climbing for nostalgia, she was climbing for evidence. She pulled back the tarp covering the old trunk tucked beneath the eaves. Robbie's handwriting stared up at her in bold black marker: "Land, Docs. Official. Do not toss. She smiled faintly, placing one hand on the lid before opening it. Inside were manila folders, each wrapped in rubber bands, labeled in her own careful print. 1983, deed, tax filings, joint, easement records, fence line agreements, loan ledger, Whitman Holdings. She knelt on the floorboards, the flashlight beam cutting a narrow circle of gold across each document as she began to lay them out in rows. Every page was a relic of Blake's rise, and her quiet underwriting of it. She saw her name listed on joint filings going back decades, tax burdens she'd shouldered, loan notes she had co-signed before Blake had even left for college. And then she found it. An application for trenching irrigation lines dated 2012, filed under Whitman Devco with no secondary signatory. That parcel, she could tell from the coordinates, cut directly through her portion of the acreage. Her chest tightened, not with surprise but with confirmation. It was one thing to suspect Blake had rewritten history in his own favor. It was another to see the edits in ink. She stood slowly, wiping the dust from her hands. This couldn't just be her war. She needed someone who could sharpen the paper trail into something Blake couldn't ignore or explain away. Back downstairs, Clara sat at her kitchen table and dialed a number she hadn't used in over a year. Lena Doyle answered on the second ring, her voice bright and unpretentious, the way locals were when they didn't care about what you drove or who you were related to. "Lena, it's Clara Whitman." There was a brief pause. "Mrs. Whitman? Wow. Been a minute." "I need a paralegal with a mean eye for detail and a low tolerance for bullshit. Are you still the same girl who got the county to reverse the Thompson grazing permit in 2021? Lena laughed. "That's me, and you sound like a woman with receipts." "I've got more than receipts," Clara said. "I've got the original invoices." By the time Lena arrived that afternoon, the kitchen table had transformed into a legal war room. Clara had laid out the deeds, permits, tax statements, and easement maps, like a surgeon prepping for the first cut. Lena took it all in with a reverent nod, sliding off her coat and rolling up her sleeves. "Jesus," she muttered, flipping through a stack of surveys. "He really thought no one would check." Clara handed her the 2012 permit. "This one was filed without my sign-off. The work was done right along my north fence line." Lena held the paper up to the light. "Unauthorized development on joint property. That's actionable." "And this," Clara added, tapping a bound statement of utilities she'd paid for the east pasture, "has my name and social security number. He's leveraged it, Lena. Quietly. For years." They worked for hours, highlighting timelines, marking overlapping assets, cross-referencing digital files with scanned originals. Clara moved like someone exercising years of restraint. Lena, quick and methodical, caught each detail with the kind of focus Clara had almost forgotten existed in younger people. Just before sundown, Clara's phone lit up with a social media alert. Against her better judgment, she opened the app. There it was. A photo of Sherry standing at the edge of the west field, holding a glass of wine and wearing a suede fringed jacket like a rodeo queen in a glossy magazine spread. Trish stood behind her with one hand on her hip, eyes squinting toward the horizon like she owned it. Caption, "Ranch Day. Nothing but inherited vibes." Clara stared at the screen for a long time, then she turned it to Lena. "We're adding that to the folder," she said. "Printed, color, date stamped." Lena grinned. "You ready to send a message?" "I already wrote it in ink," Clara said. "Now I'm just highlighting the parts he never read." They drafted the cease and desist letter together, Clara's name typed firmly at the bottom, and made 4 copies. One for Blake's office, one for his legal counsel, one for the county recorder, and one for the gate at the property line. Later that evening, Eli called. His voice was calm, but behind it sat decades of experience and restraint. "Let him file first," he said. "If he wants this in court, you greet him with ownership. Every time." Clara glanced out the window where the dusk had settled, painting her land in blue and pewter tones. "I'm not fighting dirty, Eli," she said softly, still watching the fence line. He didn't answer right away. "I know. I'm fighting exact. The steakhouse was one of those high-end places that pretended to be rustic: leather booths, vintage branding iron decor, and waiters who wore flannel shirts they'd never sweat in. Blake had chosen it carefully. It sat halfway between his downtown office and Clara's side of Elk Creek, close enough to feel neutral, expensive enough to send a message. Clara arrived 5 minutes early and waited in the truck, watching the entrance. Her hands were still, resting on her lap, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. At exactly 12:58, she opened the door and stepped into the cold. Lena followed behind, her thick black binder tucked under one arm, coat zipped to her chin. Clara hadn't told Blake she was bringing anyone. That was the point. Inside, a hostess led them to a corner booth where Blake was already seated. He rose, wearing a light blue button-down that looked professionally steamed and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Mom," he said, standing to greet her with a quick, rehearsed hug. "Glad you could make it." He extended a hand toward Lena, more wary than warm. "And you are?" "This is Lena Doyle," Clara said evenly, sliding into the booth across from him. "My paralegal." Blake blinked, caught for just a second. "Didn't realize we were making this official?" "Neither did I," Clara replied, picking up the menu and glancing at it like it didn't matter. "But then again, I didn't realize I was co-funding a ranch resort I wasn't allowed to step foot on." Before Blake could respond, Sherry arrived, flushed, overdressed, and holding a purse that cost more than Clara's car. She scooted into the booth beside Blake with the kind of overdone cheer Clara had always recognized as a warning sign. "Well, this is cozy," Sherry said. "Nothing like a family meal to get everyone smiling again, right?" Lena set her binder on the table without comment. The waiter came and took orders: coffee for Clara, soda water for Lena, a whiskey sour for Sherry, and a filet for Blake, medium rare. The moment the waiter stepped away, Blake leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Look, I didn't ask you here to argue," he said, voice low and controlled. "I just thought we could talk. Off the record. Get things back on track." "Off the record?" Lena asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean without paper? Or without accountability?" Sherry waved a hand lightly, as if that would dissolve the tension. "Let's not do anything legal, okay? We're family. This doesn't have to be dramatic." Clara turned to her. "You're right. It doesn't. That's why we brought documents." Blake's smile tightened. Clara reached into her purse and pulled out a folded spreadsheet, carefully printed and color-coded, and slid it across the table. It listed, in neat columns, the unpaid property taxes for the jointly held land, years of ignored obligations, split billing, and Clara's personal payments marked in bold. "These are the tax portions I covered when you said you'd circle back." "I waited. You didn't." Blake scanned the sheet, his fingers tightening subtly at the edge of the paper. Lena opened her binder and laid out 3 county documents with county clerk stamps, red circles drawn around permit IDs and signature lines. "And here," she said, tapping each one, "are development permits your company filed without her co-signature. One of them includes groundwater rights, on land she holds joint title to." Sherry's smile faltered. "Wait, you're saying he wasn't allowed to file those?" "We're saying he didn't have full legal standing to," Lena replied coolly, "and that's going to matter in the next 48 hours. Blake's jaw ticked. He leaned back, folding his arms. "Is this why you came? To ambush me at lunch?" Clara's eyes stayed steady on him. "You called this a catch-up. I brought what needed catching." The table fell into a silence as thick as the ribeye Blake wasn't touching. Sherry looked between them, slowly beginning to realize this wasn't going to be cleaned up with a bottle of Chardonnay and a family group text. Clara picked up her coffee, sipped, and set it down carefully. "We can finish the meal, or we can finish the conversation. Your choice." The courthouse clerk was a woman named Janie, with a soft Montana accent, and a reputation for remembering birthdays and bank fraud in equal measure. She didn't blink twice when Clara Whitman, boots dusted with snow and hair tied back like she meant business, slid a thick manila envelope across the counter. Janie took it gently, almost with reverence, and looked over the paperwork without lifting her eyes. "You want this filed as public record?" Clara nodded once. "Every word of it." Eli Torres, standing beside her in his worn wool coat, didn't say much. He didn't need to. His signature sat squarely under the complaint's letterhead, 5 pages outlining misrepresentation of property rights, improper permit filings, unpaid tax debts, and misuse of jointly held assets. Clara glanced at the bronze county seal above the clerk's desk as Janie stamped each page. The thunk of ink against paper felt louder than thunder in that quiet room. It was the sound of a fuse being lit. By the time Clara walked back to her truck, her breath turning to frost, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt still, like land that had gone too long without rain, finally beginning to crack. The following morning, Blake's attorney, a stiff-sounding man out of Billings who used phrases like good faith resolution and prefer to avoid escalation, called Eli's line. "She wants to resolve this quietly?" he asked. "No," Eli said flatly. "She wants to resolve it correctly. She understands the risk of publicity, yes? She's not the one who's been splashing family gifts across social media." There was a pause. "We're prepared to offer a settlement, a generous one." Clara was in the kitchen when Eli relayed that part. She didn't even look up from the eggs she was scrambling. "No. You haven't heard the number yet?" "I don't need to," Clara said, sliding a spatula under the pan. "I've already been underpaid." By the end of that week, the story had slipped into the pages of the Bozeman Weekly Ledger under a surprisingly neutral headline, "Family Ranch Dispute Worth Millions Lands in Court." The article was short but sharp. No names beyond a prominent tech developer and his mother, but anyone with a passing knowledge of Whitman DevCo could connect the dots. Sherry did not take it well. "You've made us look petty," she shouted into the phone the next day, voice shrill and breathy. "This was supposed to be a gift. Do you know how many influencers reposted that ranch launch?" "I'm sure they'll love the follow-up story," Clara said coolly, "about how you built it on someone else's land." Sherry's voice cracked. "You're not thinking clearly. You're 70, for God's sake." Clara smiled into the receiver. "Exactly. And I've waited long enough." She hung up without waiting for the gasp. Outwardly, Clara's life didn't change much in the days that followed. She still fed the chickens at 6, still walked the perimeter of her property in the morning cold, still poured black coffee into the same chipped mug Robbie once used. But inside the walls of her home, every moment had purpose now. Paperwork was filed, folders labeled, strategy mapped out with Eli and Lena by the kitchen table 3 nights a week. Everything done by the book, every page numbered, every line reviewed twice. Blake, meanwhile, took to the internet. It started with a cryptic tweet, the kind meant to rally supporters without naming names. "Entitlement doesn't look good at 70+. Neither does irrelevance." It got shared exactly 312 times in the first hour, mostly by real estate types and armchair sons who thought passive aggression was currency. Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. The court summons had already been delivered to his office by certified courier, signed for by a receptionist who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The front page read, "Plaintiff Clara Whitman. Defendant Blake Whitman." When Blake opened the envelope, his hands were steady, but the flush that rose to his neck said otherwise. He stared at the first page, rereading it twice, his jaw set like concrete. "She actually did it," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Sherry stood in the doorway, phone clutched in her hand, silent now. Even she didn't know what to say. The message came in at 6:43 a.m., while Clara was elbow-deep in biscuit dough. Her phone buzzed 3 times in rapid succession on the windowsill above the sink, each buzz more frantic than the last. She ignored it until the oven was preheating, the coffee was brewed, and the hens had been fed. Then, wiping her hands on a dish towel, she picked it up. Family. Sherry Whitman added you, Blake Whitman, Sam Whitman, Diane Lang, Uncle Jerry, Aunt Paula, and 3 others. The chat icon was a filtered photo of Trish in front of the stables, overexposed and undersmiling. Clara exhaled through her nose and tapped it open. Sherry. Just so everyone's on the same page, yes, Clara is suing Blake, her own son, over land that's been ours for years. No warning, no conversation, just papers. Sherry again. We're devastated. Please keep us in your prayers right now. Clara stared at the screen for a long moment. No one responded. Not at first. The little typing bubbles blinked and disappeared. Then, Diane, Blake's cousin. Wait, is this about the Elk Creek property? Uncle Jerry. Isn't that Clara's land too? I remember when Robbie fenced it himself after the flood in '84. Sherry. Number. It's complicated. Blake has been investing in it for years. Blake, she's blowing this out of proportion. I gave Trish the ranch because she needed it. Clara's fine. She's always had her home. Clara's thumb hovered over the screen. Then she walked to her filing cabinet, pulled out the scanned PDF she'd sent to Lena just days earlier, and opened it on her phone. The original deed. 1983. Whitman, Clara J. and Whitman, Blake R. Co-owners in black ink, notarized, certified, dated. She clicked the little paperclip icon. Clara, for the record. Attachment, Whitman Deed 1983.pdf. Silence. Clara returned to her biscuit dough, folding it with quiet precision, the same way she used to patch jeans or sew up torn pockets. Simple, sturdy tasks that outlasted noise. Her phone buzzed again. Sam, nephew, 30s, lives in Seattle. Honestly, good for you, Aunt Clara. Then, like an unplugged amplifier, the group chat went dead. No emojis, no thumbs up, just stillness. Later that morning, she sat across the table from Eli, sipping from a thermos while Lena reviewed the latest draft of their response brief. The sun had started to climb, dusting the fields outside with gold. They're quiet now, Clara said, more amused than surprised. Always are, Eli replied. He stirred his coffee with the end of a mechanical pencil. Until they realize you're serious, then they get scared, then they get creative. Clara tilted her head. What's next? Eli set down the pencil and looked her in the eye. They'll try emotional warfare. The same people who called you family will start calling you ungrateful, unstable. They'll say this isn't like you, that you've changed. I have, she said. Lena looked up from the brief, but not in the way they mean. Outside, wind rustled through the cottonwoods, the branches shaking like they knew something was coming. Clara pulled the PDF back up on her phone, zooming in on the year, 1983, and the ink that had never faded. She'd been younger than Blake was now when she'd signed that document, and unlike him, she hadn't needed a camera crew to make it count. That night, a friend of Sherry's from Missoula posted a vague but pointed Instagram story. So sad when greed tears families apart, especially when the greedy one wears pearls. Clara screenshot it and filed it away in a folder labeled Character Evidence, Public Perception. If they wanted to drag her into the court of public opinion, she'd meet them there too. But she preferred real court, where evidence lived, where pages were numbered, where facts outranked feelings. The surveyor's truck arrived just after sunrise, its tires crunching over frostbitten gravel as pale orange light crawled across the Elk Creek Valley. Clara stood at the gate already waiting, clipboard in hand, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She wore thick denim, work gloves, and the no-nonsense posture of someone who hadn't come to make small talk. The man who stepped out was named Ray Sullivan, broad-shouldered, late 40s, with a wind-chapped face and a tool belt that had seen actual use. He gave her a small nod as he opened the truck bed and pulled out his gear. "You sure you want this all reflagged?" he asked, glancing up at her. "From the original 1983 plot?" "I'm not guessing anymore," Clara said. "I want what's mine marked in stone, or steel, whichever holds up better." He grinned faintly. "Steel it is." By midday, the land had begun to take on new geometry. Neon pink flags fluttered where the original boundaries had been, the same ones Clara and Robbie had walked in the spring of '83, back when Blake still thought barns were made of Legos. Stakes hammered into frozen ground marked every corner, and for the first time in years, the acreage looked like what it actually was, shared, and legally so. 2 of Blake's construction trailers had been parked just over the line. Ray flagged them without hesitation. "That'll have to move," he said, tapping a post. "It's on her parcel." Clara didn't smile, but something in her shoulders softened. That afternoon, Lena filed the injunction paperwork with the county clerk's office, an emergency motion to halt all grading, trenching, and machinery activity on Clara's portion of the land until the court reached a decision. By the time it processed, a copy had been stapled to the front gate, laminated against the weather. The following morning, Clara found tire tracks in the east field, deep ones, fresh. At first, she thought maybe a neighbor had turned around on her lot, but then she saw the slats in the south fence, snapped inward, not outward, and 2 wooden posts discarded in the sagebrush like afterthoughts. She didn't panic. Instead, she opened the shed and took out 2 trail cams, motion-activated, infrared, and mounted them just above the fence line at opposite corners of the parcel. Quiet, watchful eyes, set to capture everything. 2 nights later they did. Blake's crew, faces partially obscured by beanies and neck gaiters, tearing down the marked fence under cover of darkness. 1 man laughed, another urinated in the snow, a third tossed a pink survey flag into the bed of a pickup like a trophy. Clara watched the footage 3 times. Then she copied it to a thumb drive and labeled it in permanent marker vandalism. February 11th, 1:43 a.m. She handed it to Eli without comment. He reviewed the clips in silence and gave a low whistle. "That's intimidation," he said. "And destruction of property," Lena added. "And jurisdictional sabotage," Clara said, calm as ever. The next day, they submitted the footage to the court clerk along with printed stills and timestamps. Lena's filing included a formal allegation of retaliatory interference and request for a temporary protection order on the disputed parcel. But Clara didn't stop there. She replaced the fencing herself. Twice. The first time, she did it in a windbreaker with chilled fingers and borrowed pliers. The second time, she wore Robbie's old Carhartt coat and brought thermoses of coffee, 2 fence posts at a time in the wheelbarrow he'd left behind. When Blake's men returned the following week, they didn't find a fight. They found new posts, anchored deeper, steel instead of pine, cemented into the frozen ground. They left without a word. By week's end, Clara stood on her porch with Lena beside her, both women watching the last pink flag flutter against the gray sky like it was the only truth that needed to be told. "You ever think," Lena said, squinting at the horizon, "that he underestimated you not because of your age, but because you made it look easy for so long?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she looked down at the photo still in her pocket, the one from the trail cam, where one of the men was mid-laugh, bolt cutters in hand. She folded it carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, and murmured, "He redrew the lines with ego. I'm redrawing them with evidence." The Bozeman Weekly Ledger published the piece on a Thursday morning, nestled between an op-ed about winter irrigation permits and a photo spread of the high school rodeo team. It wasn't front page, but it didn't need to be. The headline did all the work: "Developer sued by own mother over ranch fraud." The story, just under 600 words, was surgical. No sensationalism, no conjecture, just a cool recitation of facts, verified filings, and public record polls. The journalist had used Clara's anonymous tip not as gossip, but as a spark. It burned its way across inboxes and breakfast tables like dry grass catching fire. Whitman Devco was named 4 times. So was the acreage. So was the lawsuit. The paper didn't name Clara outright, just a co-owner and primary landholder since 1983, but anyone in town who'd ever bought a fence post or ordered a latte next to her at Elkhorn Cafe could fill in the blanks. By noon, the phones at Whitman Devco's downtown office were ringing, not with congratulations or curiosity, with cancellation. A proposed luxury cabin project in Bridger backed out first. The client cited emerging litigation and community trust issues. Then came a cluster of smaller holdouts, an eco-retreat near Paradise Valley, a contractor in Belgrade who abruptly paused 2 permits mid-review. Even the architect Blake had flown in from Denver sent a carefully worded email about pausing collaboration until the dust settles. By 4 o'clock, Blake's inbox was a minefield. His phone, normally glued to his hand, sat untouched on the edge of his desk. Across the room, Sherry paced in circles, arms folded tightly across her chest. "She's bleeding you out," she snapped. "Every hour this is public, you lose money." Blake didn't look up from the article. He read it for the 3rd time, face carved from stone. His jaw moved, but no words came. "She's 70, Sherry said, her voice cracking as her heels tapped sharp against the tile. "She makes jam and wears orthopedic slippers. You really think she can outlast you? Blake closed the paper slowly, folding it with precision. She's not trying to outlast me. She's trying to expose me. Sherry stopped pacing. Then give her what she wants. Make it go away. She wants to humiliate me, he snapped, finally looking up. That's what this is. It's personal. No, said a third voice, quiet but steady. They both turned. Eli Torres stood in the doorway, holding a folder and an expression like a funeral director who'd seen one too many closed casket cases. I called ahead, he said. Your receptionist let me in. Blake stood. You don't get to show up here. I represent your mother, Eli replied, and I'm here as a courtesy, not a courtesy to you, a courtesy to closure. Sherry moved to block his path, but Blake stopped her with a wave. Eli stepped forward and set the folder on the desk. The injunction has been accepted. Your permits are frozen on all shared acreage until the court resolves the matter. Then we wait, Blake said, forcing calm. No, Blake, Eli said, voice low and deliberate. You don't wait. You hemorrhage, because while you're sitting on arrogance, she's sitting on decades of documentation, paper you can't rewrite, deeds you can't undo, contracts you forgot existed because she didn't turn them into Instagram content. Sherry's lips parted, but nothing came out. She doesn't want humiliation. Eli continued. She wants what's hers. And silence won't buy it anymore. He turned to leave, then paused. By the way, he added, you'll want to return those trail cams you didn't know you were caught on. She's keeping the memory cards. After Eli left, the room was impossibly still. Blake picked up the folder, opened it, and saw the laminated photo of the broken fence. Next to it was a photocopy of the deed, the same one Clara had sent in the family group chat. Black ink. Her name. His. 1983. He didn't say a word. He just walked to the window, looked out over the downtown streets, and watched the wind stir the flags in front of his office, like they were whispering something he couldn't quite hear. The timeline stretched 12 feet across Clara's kitchen wall. Lena had printed it in wide format at the local office supply store. Columns of dates, payment entries, permit pulls, water rights requests, tax invoices, and notes in red. Each entry came with a folder to match, stacked chronologically in labeled boxes Clara had organized herself over the course of 4 sleepless nights. It wasn't just documentation, it was memory, laid out in ink. You're sure about this one? Lena asked, tapping a 2014 entry, an invoice Blake had promised to reimburse for pasture grading but never did. I remember the exact day I wrote the check, Clara said. The bank had a power outage. I filled it out by hand under the emergency lights. Teller's name was Morgan. She had a teardrop tattoo and offered me a butterscotch candy. Lena just blinked. You're a damn time machine. Eli sat at the table nearby, flipping through permit filings Blake's team had submitted over the last decade. There's something odd about these, he muttered. The signature on this 2017 well permit, it doesn't match the others. Clara looked up. Not mine? Eli turned the document around. Not his either. It's supposed to be from the LLC's operations officer, but it's too neat, too practiced. Lena frowned, pulling the matching file. You think it's forged? Eli didn't answer immediately. Instead, he retrieved a previous year's permit, held both sheets to the window, and squinted through the overlay. See how the R in Reynolds curves differently? One of these signatures is fabricated, sloppy too. If this went through a state audit, it wouldn't last a minute. Clara was quiet. Then, get it authenticated. An hour later, Lena returned from the courthouse records office, wind-blown and breathless. I went looking for the water use records for the Elk Creek parcel, she said, tossing off her coat. Guess what I found? More unpaid bills? Eli offered. No. Lena pulled out her phone and loaded a satellite photo. That. Clara leaned in. The image showed a scar on the landscape, a dark, circular bore surrounded by tracks. It sat well within her portion of the property. No easement, no permit on file, and no notice given. Just a well. Installed. Operational. Unauthorized. They drilled it last year, Lena said. "It's drawing water off your aquifer, without your consent, without your signature, and without even a whisper of notification." Clara's eyes narrowed. "And he's been billing it as part of the ranch showcase." Lena nodded. "For investors. It's on the brochure." Eli stood. "We're not just in civil territory anymore. This is bordering on fraud." That afternoon, Blake's lawyer called again, voice clipped and unnerved. "We're prepared to offer settlement," he said. "The ranch home across from the north pasture, title transferred, full maintenance handled. We'll even throw in attorney's fees." Clara raised an eyebrow. "The Blender house?" The man cleared his throat. Well, if that's how you want to phrase it." "Tell him," Clara said, "to plug it in and wait for thunder." Eli, trying hard not to smirk, scribbled the words in his legal pad. The silence that followed on the line stretched awkwardly. "Very well," the lawyer said. "We'll proceed to trial." Clara hung up first. 2 days later, the notice arrived by mail. Superior Court of Gallatin County, case set for jury trial. Docket number 27, CV 4512, Whitman v. Whitman. Hearing date, April 14th. Full jury selection eligible. Clara stood at the mailbox with the envelope in one hand and her other wrapped around a mug of black coffee. She didn't flinch. She simply turned, walked inside, and placed the notice beneath a paperweight shaped like a steer's skull. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked up a new folder, still warm from the printer, and labeled it in block ink. Criminal exposure, active investigation. The email came through just before midnight. Subject line simple and sterile. Notice of withdrawal. Whitman v. Whitman. Eli opened it first, then Lena, then Clara. Attached was a single-page PDF from Blake's junior counsel, Grant Talley, addressed to the court and co-counsel. Language tight, clinical. Effective immediately, he was resigning as counsel of record for the defendant. No replacement counsel named, no transition plan outlined. Just one thin line near the bottom. "I can no longer ethically remain on this case." Lena whistled low. "That's not a resignation. That's a red flag." Eli leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, reading the document a second time. He's jumping ship, which means either Blake lied to him or he saw something in Discovery that made his conscience itch. Clara said nothing. She simply stood, walked to her filing cabinet, and pulled out a slim folder labeled IRS, contingency, stamped with a yellow tab she hadn't touched since 2016. That afternoon, she took a quiet drive west, past the hills where tourists stopped to take photos of old barns, out toward a nondescript office park with tan brick buildings and anonymous numbered doors. One of them belonged to a federal tax consultant, retired but still sharp, who had helped Robbie once, years ago, during a messy estate audit. She stepped into his office holding a tote bag and a flash drive. "Still have room for a complicated file with clean records and dirty implications?" she asked. The man looked up from his desk and raised an eyebrow. "If it comes with a strong cup of coffee, I'll give it priority status." Clara set down the flash drive. "It's not coffee I'm bringing, it's blood work." Back at Whitman Devco, Blake slammed the door to his office hard enough to rattle the blinds. Sherry was seated on the edge of the couch, scrolling her phone in silence, face pale and tight. She looked up without flinching. "What happened now?" she asked. "Tally quit." "What do you mean, quit?" "I mean he walked," Blake snapped. "Filed a formal notice with the court and everything, didn't even call me." Sherry blinked. "That's unprofessional." "Isn't that unprofessional?" Blake didn't answer. He paced instead, hands on his hips, jaw flexing with a rhythm that said he was trying, and failing, to control the narrative unraveling around him. "She's playing a long game," he muttered. "She's stalling out the permits, dragging my name through the local press, and now she's trying to make this federal. I know what she's doing." Sherry leaned forward. "Can she?" He paused. "If she gets the IRS interested, she doesn't need to win in civil court. She just needs to make them curious." They sat in tense silence for a few beats, until Sherry said, "Maybe we should just reset. Offer her something else, something she'll take." "She doesn't want money," Blake said flatly. She wants control, she wants legacy. That's why she's not selling, that's why she's not settling. Sherry stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-dusted downtown street. "Well," she said slowly, "if this keeps up, we may need to start downsizing. That lodge built in Paradise Valley? It's already bleeding." Blake didn't respond, but he heard it. And worse, he knew she was right. Across town, Clara sat on her porch wrapped in a wool blanket, watching steam curl from the mug in her hands. Eli and Lena sat beside her, their silence companionable. She'd spent the afternoon updating the financial audit folder, marking pages with sticky tabs, one for every year Blake had used joint assets like private equity. Eli pulled a pen from behind his ear. "You realize what you just did?" Clara tilted her head slightly. "You'll tell me." "You sent up a flare to the IRS, and I've seen the file. That's not just a flare, that's a wildfire with coordinates." Lena grinned, arms crossed. "He gave Trish a ranch to flex. You just flexed the federal government." Clara didn't smile, but her eyes glinted like glass catching a morning sunbeam. Inside, her phone buzzed. Another alert, another ping from the financial analyst she'd asked to review 3 years of Whitman Devco's tax filings. She didn't rush to answer it. Some things she'd learned were worth letting ring once or twice. The first statement came from a contractor named Mitch Harlan, who'd installed irrigation pipe back in 2010, long before Whitman Devco had staff uniforms or polished brochures. He remembered Clara not just by name but by detail. "She was the one with the ledger," he wrote, "came out with coffee and copies of the permit, walked the line with us before Blake even showed, said the Westfield was rocky but honest. She signed the invoice." Lena printed it and added it to the deposition folder. The second came from a ranch hand named Denise Rucker, now working 2 counties over. She emailed late at night, full of lowercase letters and memory. "Ms. Clara used to call me Sugar when she handed out checks. She was the one who explained how to fill out my 1099. Not him, not once." Then came the voice memo from someone unexpected. "Hey, Lena," the voice began, slightly nervous. "It's Ellie, from Whitman Devco. Or, I guess, formerly." The message continued for 3 minutes. By the end of it, Lena was already typing the transcript. "I started as an intern back when Blake's office was still above the Tractor Supply store," Ellie said. "He was sharp, sure, but distracted. It was Clara who taught me how to read permit schedules, who caught a zoning error that saved us a $25,000 fine in 15. She was never on the website, but she was the infrastructure before infrastructure." Eli nodded when he read it. "We submit this in the witness summary packet. Judge'll see through the curtain." Clara didn't say much, just flipped the page and kept sipping her lemon tea. That week, Lena took a quiet drive to the Bozeman Historical Society archives, chasing a hunch. Inside a manila folder marked Regional Profiles, Women of Elk Creek, 1990s, she found a yellowed clipping from the local business column. It was an interview, dated October 1999. A reporter had asked Clara about her work helping Blake secure his first development permit through the Conservation Subdivision Act. The quote was simple. "It wasn't just his deal, it was ours. We worked for every inch." Lena scanned it, printed 3 copies, and placed one gently in front of Clara that evening. She read it in silence, fingers brushing the edges. "He was barely 20, she murmured, more to herself than anyone. "Didn't even know what an escrow officer did. Robbie and I co-signed the deposit. I had to fight with the county over runoff compliance." "You want it in the binder?" Lena asked. Clara looked up, eyes steady. "Number I wanted online." Lena smiled. "Already posted." Across town, Blake was in his conference room when his phone lit up with a forwarded post. It was Ellie's statement, paired with the 1999 clipping and a side-by-side of Clara at a county hearing in 2003. The caption read, "She wasn't just there from the beginning, she built the beginning." The post had been shared 42 times within the hour, among them 2 journalists, 1 commercial investor, and the director of a regional land trust. Blake stared at the screen, jaw slack. "This is coordinated," he muttered, but the room was empty. He paced once, twice, then hurled the phone across the room. It hit a corkboard full of pinned project maps and clattered to the floor, screen spidering on impact. The sound of glass breaking echoed in the silence. That evening, Clara sat on her porch with a quilt around her shoulders, the air just cool enough to raise goosebumps. She sipped her tea while Lena updated the public relations file, every screenshot, every repost, every whisper of recognition stacking like bricks on a foundation long denied. "Legacy documents itself," Clara said softly, looking out at the dusk. "You just have to keep the receipts." Eli chuckled. "You think he's seen it yet?" "I think he's choking on it." The offer arrived in a glossy envelope hand-delivered by courier. No return address, no email trail, no unnecessary drama. Just a 7-page document tucked into a folder too thick for its real contents. Lena opened it first. Seated across from Clara at the kitchen table, she read silently, her eyes narrowing with each line. $3.2 million, she said finally, in exchange for a full withdrawal, sealed records, and a non-disclosure agreement that would muzzle you until death or dementia, whichever comes first. Eli took the folder and skimmed quickly, brow furrowed. "They want a complete strike from public record. No verdict, no press, just a clean walkaway." Clara didn't flinch. "Put it on the pile." "It's more than we expected," Lena said. "They're rattled." "They're bleeding," Clara corrected. "That's not generosity. That's triage." She stood and walked toward the living room, where the original deed still sat framed on the mantel. The ink had faded just slightly with time, but the names remained as clear as ever. Heron his, equal weight, equal claim. "They thought money was the prize," she said. "They still think that." Back at Whitman Dev Co., Blake leaned forward in his chair while his new attorney, a steely woman out of Missoula with courtroom grit and zero patience for dramatics, clicked her pen against the edge of her legal pad. "She'll come around," Blake said, voice tight. "She always folds once the yelling's over." The attorney stared at him flatly. That woman hasn't raised her voice once in discovery, and she hasn't folded on a single clause. She's not bluffing. In the corner, Sherry dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "This is destroying our reputation," she whispered. "People think we're vultures." Trish, lounging across a leather sofa in tight jeans and entitlement, scrolled through her phone with theatrical sighs. "If she doesn't stop tagging me in old permits, I swear to God I'll sue for defamation." "Bring it," Lena said, the moment Eli read the line to her. "She'll lose too." Later that evening, Clara crafted her response with surgical precision. No emotion, no decoration, just a list. Terms of counter-settlement. Full public acknowledgement of co-ownership and historic financial contributions. Attorney's fees paid in full, including retroactive accounting hours. A $1.5 million charitable donation to the Elk Creek Land Stewardship Fund, publicly listed in Clara's name. Eli read it twice, nodded once, and forwarded it back to Blake's legal team with the subject line, "Counter not negotiable." The reply came 2 hours later,